In Washington, D.C., power flows through information. But what happens when the most sensitive military intelligence in the world ends up on the wrong phone? In the halls of power, a national security advisor makes a fatal miscalculation. On the other side of the world, a special forces team walks into a perfectly orchestrated trap. When the dust settles, 4 American soldiers are dead, 3 more captured. And the most catastrophic intelligence breach in modern history is just beginning to unravel. Signal Lost, a 6-part podcast thriller about betrayal, courage, and the devastating consequences of a world where even our most guarded communications are never truly secure. When everyone is listening, nowhere is safe. Signal Lost. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Calaroga Shark Media.
What follows is not a definitive account of Vatican intelligence operations during the Cold War, but rather a careful examination of available evidence and testimony. The complex diplomatic relationships described are based on documented investigations, declassified records, and journalistic accounts, yet many aspects remain disputed. We present one possible interpretation of these events while acknowledging that alternative explanations exist. This is not established fact, but an exploration of how the Vatican navigated between East and West during one of history's most dangerous geopolitical confrontations. This is White Smoke, Episode 11, The Commerce of Souls. Money and faith. Throughout history, these two forces have existed in uneasy tension within religious institutions. But during the Cold War, another pairing emerged within the Vatican: diplomacy and espionage. The world's smallest state became an unlikely player in the greatest ideological confrontation of the 20th century. By the 1960s, the Vatican had developed extensive networks behind the Iron Curtain. At the center of this spiritual web stood Pope John XXIII, a man the world saw as a grandfatherly figure, but whom history reveals as a shrewd diplomat who would defy both Moscow and Washington in pursuit of peace. When John XXIII told an American journalist, "I'm not afraid to talk to anyone about peace on earth," he signaled the Vatican's refusal to be merely a Western ally in the Cold War. The statement alarmed the CIA, whose director John McCone promptly requested an audience with the Pope. Their conversation would establish a diplomatic paradigm that John XXIII described with a simple, powerful phrase: the commerce of souls. Today, we examine how the Vatican built and maintained a remarkable intelligence network across communist Eastern Europe. We explore the brave priests and laity who risked imprisonment to maintain connections with Rome, key figures in Vatican diplomacy, and how these elements shaped the Cold War from behind. This is the story of the Vatican's secret Cold War and the Pope who dared to defy both superpowers in pursuit of peace. To understand the Vatican's role as a Cold War intelligence center, we must first understand the unique situation Catholics faced behind the Iron Curtain. By 1950, every Catholic bishop in Czechoslovakia had been imprisoned or placed under house arrest. In Hungary, Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty was sentenced to life imprisonment after a show trial. In Poland, despite an agreement with the government, priests were routinely arrested and harassed. For millions of Catholics living under communist rule, Rome seemed impossibly far away. The Soviet authorities viewed the Catholic Church as a potential counter-revolutionary force, a direct challenge to Marxist-Leninist ideology and a possible channel for Western influence. Catholic clergy were monitored, churches were infiltrated by state security agents, and religious practice was actively discouraged. Yet despite these obstacles, the Vatican maintained communication with Catholics across Eastern Europe. This was not accomplished through traditional diplomatic channels, which were severely limited or non-existent in most communist countries. Instead, the Vatican relied on an informal network of couriers, coded messages, and brave individuals willing to risk their freedom to maintain connections with Rome. Within the Vatican's Secretariat of State, a specialized section developed expertise in Eastern European affairs. This was not a formal intelligence agency in the manner of the CIA or KGB, but rather a diplomatic operation with elements of intelligence gathering. Its purpose was threefold: to maintain communication with Catholic communities behind the Iron Curtain, to gather information about their conditions, and to provide spiritual guidance in circumstances where normal ecclesiastical operations were impossible. The Vatican's intelligence network included a diverse cast of characters: priests who traveled under academic or cultural pretexts, nuns who carried messages sewn into their habits, laypeople who smuggled religious materials across borders, and even sympathetic diplomats from non-communist countries who carried Vatican communications in their diplomatic pouches. This network served dual purposes: gathering intelligence on the situation behind the Iron Curtain, while simultaneously providing humanitarian aid to persecuted Catholics, often at great personal risk to those involved. These operations faced enormous challenges. Soviet bloc security services actively worked to infiltrate and disrupt Catholic networks. Phones were tapped, mail was opened, and suspected Vatican couriers were followed. Those caught could face years in labor camps or worse. Despite these risks, the network persisted throughout the Cold War, providing the Vatican with a unique window into life behind the Iron Curtain, and providing Eastern European Catholics with a vital connection to their spiritual center. The Vatican's approach differed fundamentally from Western intelligence agencies. Where the CIA sought military secrets and political intelligence, the Vatican focused on religious and humanitarian concerns. This distinction sometimes created tensions with American intelligence officials, who viewed the Vatican primarily as an anti-communist ally rather than as an independent actor with its own agenda. The Vatican-CIA relationship was complex, sometimes collaborative, sometimes at cross purposes, especially as John XXIII began his unprecedented outreach to Soviet leaders in the early 1960s. When John XXIII became Pope in 1958, few expected dramatic changes in Vatican policy. At 76, the former Angelo Roncalli was viewed as a transitional figure, a caretaker who would maintain existing approaches, while a younger successor was eventually selected. Instead, John XXIII surprised both the Catholic world and international observers by charting a bold new course in Vatican diplomacy. His approach to the Cold War was shaped by his previous diplomatic experience as papal nuncio to France and his deep conviction that dialogue was preferable to confrontation, even with ideological opponents. Critically, he viewed the Vatican's moral authority as independent of Cold War alliances, believing the Church had a unique role to play beyond the binary politics of East versus West. John XXIII's approach could be seen in his 1963 encyclical Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, which called for peaceful coexistence between nations with different political systems. The encyclical was remarkable for addressing not just Catholics but all men of goodwill, implicitly including communist leaders. But the Pope's most controversial diplomatic initiative came in 1960, when he began establishing unofficial channels of communication with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. This outreach alarmed American officials, who viewed the Vatican as a natural ally in the ideological struggle against communism. CIA Director John McCone requested an audience with John XXIII to express American concerns about Vatican-Soviet contacts. According to multiple accounts, the Pope responded with a statement that encapsulated his independent approach. If the United States maintained diplomatic relations and trade with the Soviet bloc, the Vatican would continue its own trade, the commerce of souls. This phrase, while metaphorical, represented the Pope's broader commitment to the Vatican's spiritual mission that transcended geopolitical divides. He was determined to protect the Church's interests and serve Catholics worldwide, regardless of which political regime they lived under. This commerce of souls represented the Vatican's refusal to be merely an instrument of Western Cold War policy. While the Holy See remained firmly anti-communist in ideology, John XXIII insisted on maintaining direct contacts with Moscow to address humanitarian concerns, protect Catholic communities, and explore possibilities for peaceful coexistence. The Pope's initiative bore fruit during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. John XXIII issued a public appeal for peace that was broadcast by Radio Moscow and favorably cited by Khrushchev. His intervention, coming at a moment when direct communication between Washington and Moscow was fraught, provided a diplomatic channel through which tensions could be diffused. While historians continue to debate the exact extent of Vatican influence on the resolution of the crisis, the episode demonstrated how Vatican diplomacy had created channels of communication that transcended the binary opposition of the Cold War, positioning the Holy See as a unique mediator in global affairs. John XXIII's approach represented a significant evolution in Vatican Cold War strategy, from resistance to engagement, from confrontation to dialogue. This evolution was not universally welcomed within the Vatican hierarchy, where many officials remained deeply skeptical of any outreach to communist regimes. Nonetheless, the Pope persisted in his belief that even ideological enemies could find common ground in the pursuit of peace.
In a world of smartphones and quantum computing, the fate of nations rests on technology from the past. Calaroga Shark Media presents a new podcast, Pager Protocol, a 10-part espionage thriller that will change the way audiences see the world. As an unusually large shipment of pagers makes its way to a volatile region, CIA analyst Sarah Miller grows suspicious. Meanwhile, in Zion City, Nexus director Amos Ben David sets a daring plan in motion. Agent Eli Cohen is tasked with a mission that could determine the fate of his nation and reshape the entire region. Pager Protocol is available now wherever you get your podcasts.
The Vatican's dual approach, maintaining clandestine networks while simultaneously engaging in high-level diplomacy, created a unique position in Cold War geopolitics. Neither fully aligned with the West nor accommodating to communist ideology, the Holy See pursued its own distinct agenda based on religious freedom, human rights, and international stability. The practical implementation of the Vatican's Cold War strategy relied on individuals willing to take extraordinary risks. These were not professional spies, but rather clergy and laity who saw their actions as a form of spiritual resistance against religious persecution. Consider the case of Father Tomasz Węsławski, a Polish priest who regularly traveled to East Germany under the guise of academic research. His real purpose was to deliver messages from Rome to Catholic leaders and return with information about church conditions. Beyond mere intelligence gathering, he smuggled medicine, theological texts, and financial aid to support persecuted Catholic communities. During one such mission in 1961, he narrowly escaped arrest when East German security services began following him. His quick thinking, entering a department store and exiting through a different door, allowed him to complete his mission and preserve a vital link in the Vatican's Eastern European network. Or consider Sister Lucina Wojcik, a Polish nun who worked with an international Catholic aid organization. Her habit provided perfect concealment for microfilmed messages being carried across borders. When stopped by border guards, she would maintain a demeanor of innocent piety that rarely aroused suspicion, even as she carried communications that would have resulted in imprisonment if discovered. Perhaps most remarkable were the networks of ordinary Catholic laypeople who supported these operations. They provided safe houses, acted as couriers for shorter distances, and maintained the infrastructure of communication that connected isolated Catholic communities with Rome. These individuals rarely received recognition for their contributions, but their collective efforts made the Vatican's intelligence network possible. The risks these individuals faced were immense. The case of Father Jerzy Popiełuszko, a Polish priest murdered by security services in 1984, illustrates the dangers. While Popiełuszko's activism came later than the period of John XXIII's papacy, his fate reflects the continuing dangers faced by those who maintained connections between the Vatican and Catholics behind the Iron Curtain. The Vatican's Cold War operations reached their zenith during the Polish crisis of the early 1980s, when the Solidarity movement challenged communist rule. Pope John Paul II, himself Polish, utilized the networks established under John XXIII to maintain communication with Solidarity leaders and provide moral support for their efforts. This support, combined with diplomatic pressure and financial assistance channeled through Vatican networks, played a significant role in Solidarity's eventual success. The full extent of Vatican Cold War operations remains partially obscured by the Vatican's secretive nature and limited access to archives. However, enough documentation has emerged to establish the Vatican's unique role in Cold War geopolitics. A role that belies its small physical size and military insignificance. John XXIII's commerce of souls ultimately represented more than just maintaining spiritual connections with Catholics behind the Iron Curtain. It represented a distinct approach to Cold War diplomacy, one that prioritized dialogue over confrontation, engagement over isolation, and humanitarian concerns over ideological purity. This approach would be further developed by Pope Paul VI and reach its culmination under Pope John Paul II, whose Polish background and personal experience of communist rule informed the Vatican's role in the Cold War's final chapter. But it was John XXIII who first charted this course, defying expectations and conventional Cold War thinking to pursue peace through unprecedented channels. The Vatican's Cold War networks, the priests, nuns, and laypeople who risked everything to maintain connections between Rome and Eastern Europe, represent an often overlooked dimension of Cold War history. Their story reminds us that the conflict was fought not just with nuclear weapons and proxy wars, but also with information, communication, and the power of belief. As Pope John XXIII reportedly told American officials, the Church thinks in centuries. This long-term perspective allowed the Vatican to pursue a distinctive strategy in the Cold War. A strategy that, while not immediately successful in ending communist rule, maintained vital connections that would eventually contribute to communism's peaceful demise in much of Eastern Europe. The commerce of souls continued long after John XXIII's death in 1963. Its legacy lives on in the Vatican's continuing diplomatic engagement with authoritarian regimes around the world, always seeking to maintain connections with believers, even in the most hostile environments. White Smoke is a production of Calaroga Shark Media, portions of which were made with the help of AI narration.